Hi folks, and welcome to another episode of Exploring Boundaries with Loki Consulting. Today I want to talk about how to use your tests to help you squeeze out all of the design and intent that you can out of your code. In order to do that, I need to take 2 minutes to introduce the two main actors in our play. The first is BDD, Behavior Driven Design. You will largely recognize BDD because, and this is the key, it is intended to read a lot like English. So you're going to see things like expect something to equal something else, expect something to match something else, expect something to include something else, and so forth. The second player is rspec. rspec is a Ruby library that is intended to help you use BDD to express your tests. I got the following example from a recent Reddit post. I'll put the link in the description if you really want to go there, but there's not that much. I'm making a video out of this because I thought there was a lot more than could really be put into a Reddit post. The example code that was provided looks like this. Here I need to go over a particular feature of rspec. On lines 2 and 3 you have subject and let. Both of these have their values in curly brackets. This means they are lazily instantiated. And when you call these particular words in the tests, that is when the value will be called and no before. In the example you see on screen, on line 6 we call subject. And because line 6 calls subject, it means that is when we're going to execute the code on line 2 that is described class.call blorg id. And blorg id is lazily instantiated to be 53. So when we call subject in this particular case is when we call blorg id. I just need to express this because this is how rspec provides you with the idea of providing a subject under test, a particular main object, a particular main thing that you're going to test. What we have on screen now is described class.call. In other words, the subject under test is the output or the result of calling the method call on the described class itself, which is, in this case, is doSomethingService. I could make this a little bit less magic by replacing described class with doSomethingService, like this. This makes things a little bit less magical, a little bit easier for people who don't understand rspec really well. So let's keep this for now. Now let's get on to what we're expressing with this particular test, because this is the core of the reason why I'm making this video. The first problem, if we don't understand deeply BDD, is something that we get a hint of by the fact that subject is written on line 6 by itself. The subject is, if you'll forgive the grammar joke, not a verb. The subject is a thing. So if we just put subject on line 6, what we're supposed to read and understand is, here's a line that does nothing, right? It initializes data, possibly, but line 6 is expressed as, here I am, and then I go away, and then the next line does something. But that's not what's actually happening here. What's actually happening here is subject does something. What's happening is the subject runs the code under the method call in doSomethingService. So if we think about expressing this idea to represent this a little better, then the first thing we'll think about is to make this an adjustment to indicate that line 6 is doing something. And it could look like this. This would be a way to have the exact same behavior, but on line 6, it's very, very clear that now we're doing something, and that then on line 7, we expect some side effect to have occurred. And this gets to the next thing that kind of bothered me about the example when I saw it, is that we have a test that is testing a side effect. And tests should primarily test behavior. If the side effect is what we define to be the expected behavior, we are making our system and our tests more poor and more brittle, because we don't care really what subject.call does. What we care is that somewhere the request happened. And the request could be right here, it could be anywhere else, we don't really know. The way this is set up, we may or may not have a globally reset HTTP mock or something like this. And so this test is missing very important expression about what's happening. We could try to define this a little more expressively by making a change a little bit in this direction. Here I'm making one big change already from the original suggested code, which is instead of using the call method on the class, I'm using the call method on an instance of the class. This is important because it's pretty much always better to write your tests on instance methods than on class methods. In the earlier example, doSomethingService.call was clearly, I hope, intended to be a factory method. It would instantiate the object, and then it would call on the instance. But this is more explicit, and it is more explicitly a good pattern of construction. So let's stick with this for now. Now on line 4, I have defined an API client to be a mock object when it gets called, which will happen on line 2 in doSomethingService.new when we instantiate it and pass the API client to it. Now on line 7, when we do subject.call, we can then have an explicit test on the fact that the API client is going to have received this API call. This is still a side effect, but now it is a side effect that goes through a collaborator. So it is better object-oriented code. But we can go further. And here is how we go further. Again, the subject is an instance of the service. Blorg ID has no reason to change. And now we are going to have multiple describer blocks in which the API client will be defined differently such that its behavior helps us define the tests for the behavior of doSomethingService. So on line 6, we're going to have a mock Blorg API that is going to just return Blorg ID as a key to the hash, and then title, you have no chance to survive, make your time. Because that joke is hilarious. And as a result, when we're running the tests, we can just expect subject.call to equal title, you have no chance to survive, make your time. Which means now subject.call is the behavior under test. This makes a lot more sense from a design and intent perspective. We can go a tiny bit further here with when the ID isn't on the remote, we get a new API client that's going to be a more mock Blorg API with invalid post. And then when you call the subject, you're going to expect that to raise an error. We are Blorg, resistance is futile, which is to say you should handle that error somewhere above the service class. And finally, when the remote is down, you're going to have this API client here with 400 or 500 or whatever it should return. And you expect subject.call to raise a different error. And now, just like that, by bringing this API client out and making it something that we can define as part of what helps define the behavior of this service, we are now able to write very clear tests about how this is supposed to behave. Now, I want to be clear that the main reason I'm using mocks here in this example is because the example I came across was one that had the side effect of an HTTP call. And that is a prime example of when to use mocks. However, this idea is applicable in every area of your system. If you have something that is going to be global, whether it's a database or anything like this, or just a variable because I'm sure you have a good reason, then if you are able to bring it out as a collaborator in your tests and then pass that in, you're going to have more control over the definition of the behavior of the object under test. BDD and rspec specifically gives us this subject. And the idea is that you can expect the subject to something, right? What you're looking for ideally with something like this is really expect subject. And that means you probably will have something like this, right? The idea, the desired behavior, the way rspec wants to be used is that when you read the test, you just expect the subject, like your expectations, your assertions are on the subject. And what that means is whatever needs to have happened probably needs to happen beforehand. Well, this makes me uneasy because I prefer to have behavior under test instead of a subject under test. So I prefer to have the behavior clearly called out in the test so that I know where to go. In tests, duplication is a good thing because the most important thing when it comes to tests is that first, that it be correct. Second, that it be understandable. And third, that it be changeable. There's almost zero other concerns when it comes to your test suite that are important and are worth respecting. So if you have to write something 8 times, resist extracting it until you are positive that this helps the expression of intent in your test suite. Because if you make the test suite harder to change, you're going to make it more painful to work with. And that means you're going to make it more painful to make changes that you trust work. And that means you're going to make it more painful to maintain the code base and refactor it. And no one wants to go down that road because 3 weeks down that road is legacy code. I hope I've helped you squeeze out more intent out of your test design by both defining the collaborators better and defining the behavior under test better. Hey tricksters, thanks for watching. If you like this, smash that like, subscribe, and consider donating so I can keep making content for you. See you all next time.